Hello! So the funny thing about this video is, while I'm filming this, it is Friday, and hopefully you will be seeing this video on Friday. And I came up with this video idea last night, and then today, while I was at work, Elliot Brooks also posted a video recommending scary books to people who don't like scary books, which is just really, really weird and maybe even spooky. So I will link Elle's video down in the description bar for you, and I suggest that you go and give that a watch. But I'm going to get into my spooky recommendations for scaredy cats. I'm going to start with a middle grade book. This is The Dreadful Tale of Prosper Redding by Alexandra Bracken, which follows the story of Prosper, who is cursed, and his family is cursed, and he is then possessed by a demon and basically kicked out of his family as a result. And so he has to try and figure out a way to get rid of this demon, but the only way to get rid of it is to die. But if he does that, then the demon will be inflicted upon the earth. And this is quite creepy in a lot of places, but it's also quite comical in a lot of places. So I think it's a really, really great one if you like middle grade and you're looking for something a little bit creepy. There's quite a lot of bug horror. Is that a thing? I don't know. I think there's quite a lot of bug horror and a very, very, very light body horror, I think is what it's called. But I was legitimately a little bit creeped out while I was reading this book, and it's a book for kids, so that's the level we're looking at here. Okay, I'm going to move on to another middle grade book now, but I'm also transitioning into a separate section of this video, which is, as I was collecting these books together, I hadn't realised how many of them had red themes on their cover. So this is City of Ghosts by Victoria Schwab, and I appreciate if you're going to be reading a Victoria Schwab book in October, it's probably not going to be this one. It's probably going to be The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, but I love this book. This follows Cassidy Blake, who can see ghosts, and her best friend is a ghost, and her parents are ghost hunters, and they go to Scotland to make a documentary about ghost hunting, and Cassidy comes into contact with some not so friendly ghosts that she has to try and defeat without losing her soul, and it's a little bit creepy. I love this because it reminds me of the Mediator series that I grew up reading as a teenager. I've mentioned it tons of times on my channel, and I'm not including that series in this list because it doesn't have those creepy vibes where this does, but I will say that the sequel to this, Tunnel of Bones, is much creepier than this one. So this one is kind of paranormal horror. I don't know what any of these terms are for horror because I don't read it. The next one within the red theme, and I am indeed wearing a red jumper, I've just put those things together, is Eight Will Fall by Sarah Harrion, which is fantasy. So it's set in a world where magic exists, but it's outlawed, and then an evil is rising up from the caverns beneath the city of Demura. And so the illegal magic users, empaths, are called upon to descend into these caverns in order to defeat this evil. And there's a lot of dark caves with things around corners and we don't know what they are, and noises in the dark, and being crept up on, and waking up to find people missing or dead, and body horror and jump scares, but all light enough for someone like me. I really enjoyed this. We're now transitioning slightly between the red books and the vampire books, because there's something about vampires that are still a little bit creepy, but not too scary for my fragile soul. So first up we have The Beautiful by Renee Ahdieh, and this is one where that creepiness is really just a lot of atmosphere. So this is set in New Orleans in 1872, and it's subtle. There's hints of vampires throughout the story. There's stuff happening in the dark and people going missing and murders happening, and again with the dark alleyways with things that you can't quite see, and vampires are mentioned and hinted at quite a lot, but it's subtle. It's there, you know it's there, but it's not sparkly vampires who are vegetarians, you know? And like I said, it's just the atmosphere that adds the creepy vibes to this, and it's essentially a vampire murder mystery. It's great, and I have the sequel and I'm really looking forward to reading that at some point, but I do definitely recommend this for that light, creepy, atmospheric read. Next up we have Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice, which is meant to be like classic horror, but I didn't find this scary at all. There's definitely lots of blood and gore, so if you're squeamish, I mean, it's not awful, it's still on this list, but there is a little bit of blood and gore and things, and there's some questionable morality that's going on here. This one is also atmospheric, but in a more distanced way. It's like you're watching something happening rather than standing in the scene seeing it happen around you. Subtle distinction, but it's definitely a different kind of atmospheric. But if you like a more classic writing style, then this is a really great one for that. But if you want a true classic, and if we're on the subject of vampires, I couldn't not mention Dracula. Now, this is the original vampire story as far as I know, and again, it's classic horror, but I did not find it scary at all. This is, again, atmospheric, and it's atmospheric more in the same way as Interview with the Vampire. I can definitely see how this was inspired by this. This again is sort of environmental atmosphere rather than action-based atmosphere. Does that make sense? I don't think it really does. This is quite slow, and again, there are things happening around the characters, but it's all very unexplained, and it's very dark, and the characters are scared, so you're experiencing their fear, but because you're very slightly removed from the story, it's not super scary. And I think it's worth reading this if you like vampire fiction, because there's so many nods in here and you can see where vampire stories have drawn from this throughout the years. But if you are still interested in the Dracula story but you don't want to read Dracula, instead you could read The Deathless Girls by Kieran Millwood Hargrave, which is about Dracula's wives. So if you've read this, you will know that Dracula's wives are very briefly mentioned in a couple of places, but they aren't given a lot of page time. So Kieran Millwood Hargrave decided to give them that page time. This is slightly more adventurous than some of the others that I have mentioned, and it's slightly more mysterious than some of the others that I've mentioned, but you still have that sense that there's something going on that needs to be sussed out, and it's just in the corner of your eye. You can't quite see it, and so there's that ominous feeling. And because you know that this is a Dracula's wives story, you know what that thing is, so you just sat there on the edge of your seat waiting for it to happen. So it definitely has that tension and that anticipation, but because you know what's coming, it's not so scary. I definitely recommend this if you want that Dracula vibe, but you don't want to actually read Dracula. Or if you've already read Dracula and you just want more. This is good for that too. Taking a little bit of a detour now away from the vampires and into creepy nature. Next up I have The Twisted Tree by Rachel Burge, which is the young end of young adult, older end of middle grade, so really it's suitable for both. This one is a Norwegian inspired story and it's quite creepy. I don't know what it is about me being more creeped out by middle grade stories than any of the young adult ones I'm mentioning on here, because the two books on this list that I found the most scary are this one and The Dreadful Tale of Prosper Redding. So I don't know, but this is about Martha, who is blind in one eye, and she is starting to develop this ability that allows her to touch other people's clothes and know things about them. And she wants to figure out why this is happening to her. So she decides to travel to Norway to visit her grandmother. But when she gets there, there's a random boy in her grandmother's house, and there's lots of spooky goings on that are to do with the Twisted Tree. And I'm not going to say any more than that, but this is very creepy. It's also got that Norse mythology sort of hanging over it, so if you like that kind of thing, this is great for that. But it's definitely a read it with the light on kind of story, to be honest. And I know that sounds pathetic, but that's what this video is, so I'm going to embrace it. Another semi-tree based story, kind of not really, is The Hazel Wood by Melissa Albert. So this follows Alice, and her mum have been on the run for as long as she can remember, but she doesn't really know why. All she knows is that every time they settle down somewhere, something goes wrong and they have to leave. And she also has this elusive grandmother who wrote a very famous book of dark fairy tales that Alice has never been able to read, and she doesn't really remember her grandmother very much, and she's not allowed to ever see her. And then her grandmother dies and her mother disappears, and Alice has to go on a journey to try and find out what's happened to her mother and discover the secrets of her grandmother. And once again, this is one of those cases where there's stuff that's just out of the corner of your eye. You can see it coming, but you can't figure out what it is. It's creepy, there are jump scares, there's that slightly atmospheric, ominous tone throughout the story, or at least I thought so. The dark fairy tale elements bleed in. There are kind of monsters involved. It's urban fantasy sort of, and I was surprised by how much I enjoyed this. I thought I was going to enjoy it, but it was just so much more than I was expecting. And then finally, I had to throw a dystopian onto this list, and an old style dystopian where it's actually pretty desperate and hopeless, not some of the newer, modern, more hopeful dystopians. And I decided to go with The Long Walk by Stephen King, because I feel like even on a scaredy cat spooky story recommendations list, you kind of need some Stephen King, right? I mean, I don't know, this is the only one of his that I've read, but this is a story about The Long Walk, which is a competition in which 100 boys must walk no slower than 3 miles per hour for as long as they can. And if they drop below speed, they get a warning. If they get 3 warnings, they're out for good. It's really ominous. It's really tense. I honestly felt exhausted while I was reading these boys walking these miles and miles and miles, and they can't stop for anything. They can't stop to take a break or to drink or to eat or even to go to the toilet. They cannot stop walking, and so I was thoroughly gripped by this, but it is disturbing. Everything that goes on is disturbing. Once again, there's blood and gore involved in this one, and I think if you want a really immersive experience where you feel like you're being dragged along by the characters on this journey, then this is a really, really fabulous one for that. And that is 10 spooky books for scaredy cats. And if you've read any of these, please let me know. Did you find them scary, or am I even more of a scaredy cat than I thought I was? And do go and check out Elle's video as well. She has some fantastic recommendations on that list. Some of them I've already read, some of them I'll be adding to my TBR, and that's it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and want to see more like this from me, then do think about hitting that subscribe button, and I hope to see you here again soon. Thanks! Bye!